I got married last week to my husband Chad. Right now we're supposed to be enjoying our honeymoon, but instead it's been incredibly stressful and difficult largely because of the drama stirred up by Chad's mother Elizabeth during our wedding. For context, Elizabeth has been a major source of tension in our lives since the day Chad introduced me to her. She's never really liked me. She always had a very different idea of who her son should marry. According to Chad, his mother had her heart set on one of her family friend's daughters, but Chad had no interest in her. As a result, his mother was furious with him when he started dating me. She once even told me how I was just a temporary fling for Chad to play around with until he got bored. I was understandably furious and gave her back by saying that Chad wasn't some prize to be won and that I was having a lot of fun playing around with him too. Despite her strong disapproval, Chad has always stood by me. He always made it crystal clear to her and to everyone else in his family that he planned on spending the rest of his life with me. This would cause Elizabeth to get furious with him and even threaten to cut off all contact, but Chad's commitment to our relationship has never wavered. Things took a particularly harsh turn when Chad proposed to me and I said yes. He did not bother informing her as he was tired of her dissuading him. So she had to find out about our engagement from some of her mutual friends. This caused her to have an extreme reaction. She called Chad absolutely furious, yelling at him about how he had embarrassed her by not informing her about the engagement before telling everyone else. She was insane that he had chosen to stay with me, someone she felt was unworthy of her son. Chad, always calm in these situations, explained that he had deliberately not shared the news with her to avoid any negativity. He didn't want to deal with her disapproval or let it ruin what was supposed to be a joyful moment for us. In response, Elizabeth made an extreme threat. If Chad really went through with marrying me, she would refuse to eat any food and would starve herself to death. Chad found her threats absurd and simply laughed it off. He told her that she could do whatever she wanted and even made a sarcastic comment that she might look better by losing a few pounds. This only fueled her anger further, and she became even more enraged. She then threatened to cut Chad off completely if he went ahead with the marriage, but he wasn't swayed by her ultimatum. Failing in her attempts to manipulate her son, Elizabeth then tried to reach out to me directly, attempting to persuade me that I was making a grave mistake by marrying her son without her blessings. Her messages were filled with hate, and she even went so far as to say that she hoped my soul would burn in hell for what I had done to her. It was a deeply hurtful, intense response, and I was sick and tired of her always trying to ruin our happy moment. As a result, when it came time to invite people to our wedding, we did not send Elizabeth an invitation. Chad's father, who had been invited, called us inquiring about why his wife had not received any invitation and how apparently she had been crying for hours in her room at this insult. Chad's father insisted that Chad and I come to his house for a sit-down with Elizabeth to resolve our issues and hopefully move past the whole drama. He made it clear that his family would be very upset if his mother was not included in our wedding. Reluctantly, Chad agreed, hoping that a face-to-face conversation might smooth things over. The next day we went to meet with Elizabeth, but the encounter was far from constructive. The following day we went to meet with his mother, Elizabeth, and from the moment we arrived, it was obvious she wasn't interested in having a constructive discussion. Instead, she acted as though she were the victim in the situation. Throughout the conversation, Elizabeth stared angrily at me, her eyes filled with contempt, and it was clear she blamed me for everything that had gone wrong. Chad's father, trying his best to mediate, asked Elizabeth to apologize to us for everything she had done to cause this unnecessary tension and conflict. However, this suggestion only made her more furious. She exploded in anger, yelling at both Chad and his father and accusing them of being so foolish for not recognizing the kind of woman I was. She insisted that she only wanted what was best for her son and I was clearly not good enough for him. I could feel my frustration building up, so in an effort to get some clarity, I directly asked her why she had never approved of me from the beginning and what kind of woman she believed would be suitable for Chad. She expressed how she didn't like the fact that I was a working woman and that I earned as much as Chad. She went on to claim that women like me, women who are financially independent, would have no problem cheating on or leaving their husbands if things went south. Hence, I was not the right fit for the family. She argued that Chad needed a more homely woman who could take on the traditional role of a wife. Elizabeth also brought up how in her culture women were expected to do everything at home and only the man was supposed to work. She accused me of being selfish because according to her, I made Chad do half of the work at home, which she believed was unacceptable. It was clear that her issue wasn't just with me but with a bigger idea of gender roles in our relationship. Thankfully, Chad stood up for me and he told her that it was his choice to be a good partner by sharing household duties and he liked that we both earned well. He reminded his mom how years ago when his dad lost his job, they were almost homeless and had to ask for financial help from their grandparents. He pointed out how in our case, if either of us lost our job, we both knew the other could step in and take care of things without needing to borrow money from anyone. I felt so proud that Chad genuinely appreciated and understood me for who I am. Chad's father agreed with him and urged Elizabeth to see past her cultural beliefs and learn to accept me for who I am, otherwise they might end up losing out on their son forever. In the end, after much tension and debate, Elizabeth reluctantly agreed to step back and keep her opinions to herself regarding our relationship. While she didn't fully accept me, I wasn't particularly bothered by that. What mattered most to me was that she would stay out of our business and refrain from making any further comments, which is what I had always wanted. With that agreement in place, we moved forward with inviting her to the wedding. Throughout the planning of the wedding, Elizabeth did try to make things a bit difficult, but it was still manageable. However, one of the major issues arose when she insisted on wearing a very light blue dress to the ceremony, a color so pale it could almost be mistaken for white. Given the importance of the bride being the only one in white, this felt like a passive-aggressive move. I let my husband handle the situation, and he very firmly made it clear to her that if she showed up in that dress, we wouldn't hesitate to ask her to leave. Ultimately, she backed down from the light blue dress idea. However, on the wedding day, she showed up in a black dress as if she were attending a funeral instead of her son's wedding. It was a clear statement, as if she wanted to signal her disapproval of the union. I could have let it upset me, but I chose to ignore it. I didn't want her attention-seeking antics to overshadow what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. So I decided to let it go, focusing on the joy of marrying Chad rather than allowing Elizabeth's behavior to steal the spotlight. As I was preparing to walk down the aisle and waiting for my dad to join me so that we could walk down the aisle together, Elizabeth approached me unexpectedly. I was already feeling a whirlwind of emotion, so when she asked to speak to me, I wasn't sure what to expect. She began by telling me that she had been speaking with some of her family members and had learned that my dad was going to be the one walking me down the aisle. I nodded, and without hesitation, she went on to express that she didn't think it was the right thing for him to do. Confused and taken aback, I asked her why she felt that way. In response, she answered that because of my dad's condition, it would not be a good look for the family and that people might talk. Over the years, he worked hard to regain as much independence as he could. Initially, when Chad and I had asked him to walk me down the aisle, or to accompany me as I walked, my dad was overwhelmed with emotion. I could see how much it meant to him. He did express concern that people might gossip or make comments about his condition, but I assured him that none of that mattered to me. He was my dad, and I wanted him by my side. So Elizabeth's rude comment struck a nerve. I was stunned that she could say something so callous, especially on such an important day. Clearly, her focus was entirely on appearances, completely disregarding the emotional significance of the moment. My dad had been through so much, and for her to reduce his presence to a bad look for the family felt cruel and heartless. And this is why me and Chad had intentionally kept the plan for my dad to walk me down the aisle from Elizabeth, knowing how harsh and critical she could be. But now that she had found out, she was adamant that I should change the plan. She insisted that because Chad's father had contributed towards the wedding, he should be the one to walk me down the aisle. According to her, my dad should just sit as a spectator and let a real man like her husband take on that honor. Her words stung like a slap in the face. The blatant disrespect towards my dad after everything he had gone through made my blood boil. Calling her husband a real man in comparison to my dad, who had survived so much and worked so just to be able to accompany me on this day, was too much. I was seeing red, and I swear if it hadn't been my wedding day, I would have grabbed her by the hair and dragged her out of the venue right then and there. But before I could even get a word in to shut her down, my dad approached. He must have noticed the anger and frustration on my face because he immediately asked me what was wrong. At that moment, I had to take a deep breath and count to 10, reminding myself that today was supposed to be about love, joy, and celebration, not about fighting with my mother-in-law. The last thing I wanted was for Elizabeth's negativity to cast a shadow over this special day. I smiled politely, swallowing the words I wanted to hurl at her, and told Elizabeth to please take her seat because I would be walking down the aisle with my dad as planned. She gave me a look of disapproval, shaking her head as if she was disappointed in me, but I didn't care. She turned and walked away to take her seat, and I was left standing there with my dad. No matter what Elizabeth thought or said, my dad was the one walking me down the aisle, and that was all that mattered. As I took my father's hand, I knew I had made the right choice. The rest of the wedding ceremony unfolded beautifully. As I walked down the aisle, Chad did notice that something seemed off about my expressions. I tried my best to hide the hurt and focus on the joy of the moment, but it was clear that the earlier conversation with his mother had affected me. After the ceremony, when we finally had a quiet moment together, Chad asked me what had happened. I didn't want to keep it from him, so I confessed everything Elizabeth had said, how she had tried to convince me to let his father walk me down the aisle instead of my own dad, claiming my father's condition would be a bad look for the family. Chad was furious. His protective instincts kicked in immediately, and he told me that he was going to ask his dad to escort his mother out of the wedding immediately. He felt that she had crossed the line and had no right to be there after saying something so cruel. While I appreciated his support and understood his anger, I didn't want to make a scene. I knew that causing a commotion would only give Elizabeth the attention she seemed to crave. The last thing I wanted was for her to steal the spotlight on what was supposed to be our day. I urged Chad to let it go, just for the evening. I reassured him that we could address the situation later in private, once the wedding was over. Reluctantly, Chad agreed but did apologize to me repeatedly for what his mother had said. He was genuinely upset by her actions and promised we would deal with it later. For the rest of the evening, Chad and I did our best to savor every moment of the celebration, surrounded by friends and family who genuinely cared about us. When it was time for the speeches, both my father and my father-in-law gave incredibly heartfelt and emotional words. It was heartwarming to hear the love and pride in their voices. A few of my cousins and some of Chad's family members also took the microphone to share their joy about our union, offering kind words and well wishes. During all of this, I couldn't help but notice Elizabeth sitting in silence, drinking heavily. She seemed to be fuming, her expression tight as if she were barely containing her frustration. I tried to ignore it, hoping the rest of the evening would pass peacefully. But then one of our relatives, likely without realizing the tension, passed the microphone to Elizabeth and urged her to speak a few words for her son and his new bride. The moment the mic landed in her hands, I turned to look at Chad, worried about what she might say. He looked just as tense as I was. I prayed that his mother would simply offer a polite congratulations and wish us the best, and then sit down without causing a scene. But deep down, I feared Elizabeth wouldn't be able to resist taking a jab. And unfortunately, I was right. Elizabeth stood up, slightly swaying perhaps because of the multiple drinks she had, and started announcing how she just couldn't believe her baby boy had gotten married. She said that as a mother, nothing could be more joyful than watching her child become a grown man. She then paused, took a deep breath, and continued to say that her son's wedding was almost perfect, when it could have been even more perfect had the bride not allowed her father to walk her down the aisle. I gasped, utterly horrified. Elizabeth remarked on how uncomfortable it was to see a wheelchair person accompanying the bride and how she felt pitiful that my dad couldn't even hug me or stand next to me properly. Everyone looked stunned at her speech. Her words were beyond cruel. They were demeaning and insensitive. My dad, who had been through so much, had every right to walk me down the aisle. And for her to humiliate him like that publicly, to reduce him to his disability in front of all our guests, was unforgivable. I could barely hold myself back from lashing out at her right then and there. As she stood there, holding the microphone, completely unbothered by the damage her words had caused, as Elizabeth continued her tirade, my husband gestured to the staff to cut off the microphone, but that didn't stop her. She kept going, now accusing my dad of being selfish for not stepping aside in the first place, claiming that as the bride's father, he should have understood how the groom's family would be embarrassed to see him in a wheelchair. I could feel tears welling up in my eyes as I glanced over at my father, who sat there silently, his face flushed with humiliation as he absorbed every cruel word she held. Before she could insult us further, Chad, absolutely furious, stormed over to his mother and snatched the microphone from her hand. Without hesitation, he turned to his father and demanded that he escort her out of the venue. There was no argument or hesitation from his dad. He stood up immediately, clearly ashamed of Elizabeth's behavior. He grabbed her arm, trying to pull her away from the situation, but Elizabeth resisted. The entire room fell into stunned silence. Guests looked on in shock and disbelief. Some of them looked mortified, while others averted their eyes, unsure of what to do. I felt my heart shatter as I saw the look of embarrassment and pain on my father's face. He had done nothing but love and support me, and now he had been humiliated in front of everyone on my wedding day. I felt sick to my stomach, devastated that this was happening. As Elizabeth was being removed, she kept shouting drunkenly that she was only speaking the truth and that other guests thought the exact same thing. That was when Chad, filled with anger and disgust, shouted at her that he was ashamed of having a parent like her and for her to get the hell away from us. He told her he never wanted to see her face ever again. Security and Chad's father eventually managed to physically drag Elizabeth out of the venue as she continued to curse at me. It was surreal, like something out of a nightmare. I was shaken. All I could think about was my father. I rushed over to him, my heart breaking as I saw how hurt he was. He tried to reassure me that he was okay, but I could see how embarrassed and anxious he felt after hearing her words. Elizabeth had successfully turned what should have been one of the happiest moments of my life into a memory tainted by her cruelty. Ever since then, I don't know where my husband's head is at, but I just want us to stand by our words and never see her again. Update 1 for everyone asking, our wedding guests were as embarrassed by Elizabeth's speech as we were. None of them agreed with her behavior. After Elizabeth was escorted out, many guests approached me to express their sympathy and frustration, describing Elizabeth's actions as ridiculous and unacceptable. They assured me that they did not agree with her behavior and were supportive of Chad's decision to stand up for me. Some of Chad's cousins even shared that Elizabeth had always had a history of being unhinged when it came to her only son, but they also expressed their pride in how Chad had handled the entire situation. As for my husband, I finally had a serious conversation with him about his mother, which I had been avoiding since we were still on our honeymoon. I explained to him how I couldn't stop thinking about the humiliation and the way Elizabeth's words had affected me and my family. I also made it clear I couldn't endure any more of her toxic behavior and expressed my desire for us to cut her out of our lives to prevent any further harm. Chad listened carefully, his face reflecting the same pain and frustration I felt. He agreed with me and acknowledged that Elizabeth's behavior was completely unacceptable. He told me he planned to meet with his parents after our honeymoon to let them know about our decision. Chad made it clear that if his father opposed the decision to cut Elizabeth out from our lives, then he was even prepared to take a stand and cut his father off as well. Honestly, it's such a relief that my husband is not as crazy as his mother. Update 2, it's been 2 weeks since my last update. I would like to thank everyone for constantly checking up on me. As for the update, when Chad finally confronted his parents about his decision, the reaction was as difficult as we had anticipated. His mother was particularly distraught, pleading with him to reconsider and trying to make him feel guilty for cutting her out of our lives. She even went so far as to suggest that Chad and she could maintain a relationship without my presence, implying that he didn't have to be a coward and simply follow his wife's wishes. Chad, firm in his decision, refused to be swayed by their pleas or threats. He made it clear to her that our relationship always comes first and left them to process the news, knowing that we needed to prioritize our own mental health and well-being even if it meant severing ties with his mother. Since then, Elizabeth has been relentless in her attempts to contact me. She has bombarded me with messages and voicemails, which have only grown more aggressive over time. Initially, I considered blocking her everywhere, but a friend suggested I keep a record of all her communications. This way, if the situation escalates further, I would have a documented history of her behavior, which could be useful in pursuing a restraining order if necessary. In her voicemails, Elizabeth has made several threats against me. She has expressed her intentions to destroy my life and even voiced her hopes that I never become a mother. The threats have been disturbing and deeply unsettling, making it clear that her anger and bitterness were far from resolved. Update 3. Okay, I'm surprised by how some of you all guessed right. Today, Elizabeth showed up at our house unannounced, and of course, Chad wasn't home. I was alone and felt a surge of anxiety when I heard the loud banging on the door. Looking at the door camera, I saw Elizabeth standing outside, visibly agitated and distressed. I had no intention of letting her in since it could lead to another explosive confrontation, and I just didn't have the emotional energy to deal with her right now. I spoke to her through the Ring doorbell, informing her that Chad wasn't at home and that she was not welcome to enter. Hearing my voice, she became even more agitated. She began shouting at me, calling me a home wrecker, accusing me of deliberately keeping her child away from her. I remained quiet as I did not want to escalate. However, she then started using derogatory words and even threatened to strangle me if she ever saw me outside. Her threats shook me up, and I knew then enough was enough. I had to take action to protect myself. I warned her that I would call the police if she didn't leave. This only seemed to escalate her aggression. In a fit of rage, Elizabeth dropped her bag and began kicking the door with a terrifying force. Given her size and the way she was acting, I was genuinely scared. Her physical aggression made me fear for my safety. Recognizing the urgency of the situation, I immediately called the police. I explained the situation to them, detailing Elizabeth's threats and her violent behavior at my door. While waiting for the police to arrive, I stayed by the door camera watching her every move. She looked like a maniac trying to break open our door. I also called my husband and told him about the situation. He assured me that he would immediately leave work and drive back to our place. When the police finally arrived, Elizabeth showed no sign of calming down, even in front of the officers. Her outbursts continued, and she openly expressed how she wanted me dead. This level of hostility left the officers with no choice but to arrest her on the spot. It was surreal and frightening to see her being taken away. Once Elizabeth was in custody, the officers took a statement from me and they reassured me that she would be spending the night in jail and they promised to follow up on the situation. Despite the lingering fear and distress, I felt a small sense of relief knowing that at least for now I was safe and the immediate threat was under control. When Chad came home, he found me in tears on the sofa. He wrapped me in a comforting embrace, trying to soothe me. It was clear that he was as upset and bewildered as I was about his mother's behavior. We both realized that this situation couldn't be simply brushed aside. Elizabeth's actions had crossed the line that warrants serious consequences. Together, we have both agreed that we need to take decisive action to ensure this won't happen to us again. Dropping the case against her is not an option. We want her to be held accountable for her threats to my life and her aggressive behavior. It is important to us to pursue legal action, not just for our own peace of mind but also to prevent any further incidents. Update 4. Hello, Redditors. It's been 5 months since my last update. A lot has happened since then. First of all, Elizabeth was found guilty of harassment and was sentenced to pay a heavy fine as well as perform mandatory community service. The court also issued a restraining order to ensure she would not be able to contact me or come near me ever again. In the aftermath, Chad's father has reached out to me to apologize repeatedly. He expressed deep regret over the way things had turned out. While his apology doesn't erase the damage done, it was a step towards acknowledging the seriousness of Elizabeth's behavior and taking responsibility for it. Initially, when my father learned about the whole ordeal, he took matters into his own hands. Despite his own physical challenges, he visited Elizabeth and her husband in person after she was released on bail. He made it clear to them that although he was paralyzed, he would not hesitate to protect me and ensure that Elizabeth faced serious consequences if she ever dared to threaten me. He reminded them that he had a gun and would not hesitate to use it if she ever tried to come near me again. I'm sure Elizabeth must have been appalled and shaken up to see my dad so furious. Also, I decided to make a Facebook post to address the situation more publicly and to ensure that everyone understood the gravity of Elizabeth's actions so that she could not manipulate the story later. In it, I detailed the harassment and included the video footage of Elizabeth shouting at me and attempting to kick our door down. My goal was to expose her dangerous behavior and ensure that our family and friends knew the truth. Chad and I have made the decision to move to a new home, one whose location we will keep confidential except from a select few trusted individuals. We're hopeful that this move will provide us with the fresh start we need. If Elizabeth attempts to violate the restraining order or harass us again, she will face some serious jail time. Currently, we're focused on building a positive future and are determined not to let Elizabeth's actions dictate our lives any longer.